It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. And I do hope to have a very, very engaging conversation with you all. Well done for the great work. I mean, the Africa Policy Conversations is incredible. And I think this is a fantastic initiative that young people are interested in trade. They're interested in the prosperity of Africa, and they're interested in the growth of businesses. So this is actually very, very fantastic. So the way I have structured my conversation this afternoon from West Africa, Nigeria, is to ask the question, is trade good for Africa? Is trade good for Africa? If trade is good for Africa, then you may want to ask, why is Africa poor? Is trade good? Or let me say, is trade good in the first place? So that's first question. If you then come to the continent and ask the question, is trade good for Africa? I believe most people will answer, yes, trade is good for Africa. So if trade is good for Africa, I think what we may want to think about before the end of this meeting is to then wonder, if trade is good for Africa, why is Africa poor? Or you may want to look at it this way: if trade is good for Africa and trade is good, why are all the other continents, why have they benefited enormously from trade and prospered from trade, but that is not the case with Africa? So I think those are the questions that we need to have at the back of our mind as we look through trade and, of course, other things that are around trade. So for the next perhaps another 20 or 25 minutes, I've structured my presentation. I don't have any slide, but I've structured my presentation around three questions that tie in to the big question of, is trade good for Africa? So the first one is, how important is the US for Africa economic relations? And the reason why that is important is because we know what is happening in the global economy today. You only need to listen to any global news or even domestic news, and everyone is talking about it. That has been the topic since January 20th, and that is still the topic. And I believe over the coming 2-3 years, this will still be a major issue. That's trade, the US trade relations with the world. But our focus here this afternoon is looking at it from Africa perspective. That's the first. The second question, I believe we should also tie into the big question of whether trade is good for Africa or whether trade is good at all, is what is happening to AfTA. That's the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. I will just share a little bit on what I think is happening, and then it will also tie into the question, is trade good for Africa? Then the third dimension we'll look at is trade important for growth in Africa? Is trade important for growth in Africa? So these are the three dimensions that I'll be looking at. Of course, always bearing in mind the big picture of whether trade is good and whether trade is good for Africa. So thank you all for joining, and I genuinely hope that we can have a truly engaging conversation here. So let's talk about the US and Africa economic relations. So I think the first context I want to share with you is that the US is the largest economy in the world. Is the largest economy in the world. So imagine that you have Nigeria, you have South Africa, you have Egypt, those three economies put together, and of course, in the context of Africa. So those are the big economies in Africa, those three. Then imagine, let's just assume that those three economies they are one country. You can imagine how important they are to the continent. So America economy is a super economy. So we're talking about a 29 trillion US dollar economy. 29 trillion. Meanwhile, they had just about 350 million people. In Africa, we are about 1.4 billion people, and our total GDP is just about 3 trillion. So it means that you can fit in Africa's economy almost 10 times into that of America. I mean, that is how big the US is. So if something is that big, whatever they do have impact, especially on small nations like Africa. So there are both direct and indirect economic relations. So we already know the size of the economy. So how does this actually affect Africa? It affects Africa in two broad ways. One directly and the second indirectly. So when we talk about directly, we're talking about, say, Nigeria, Kenya, Lesotho, South Africa, selling their goods directly to the US, maybe say through AGOA, Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. So that is direct. But when we say indirect, we are talking about, let's say, some policies of the US are driving interest rate up. And because it's driving interest rate up, Africa needs to borrow. And because of that, the interest rates in which African economies are borrowing is also going up. So that is direct and indirect. So most of the impact of US economic relations on Africa are actually indirect. They're indirect. And let me contextualize that further. The total trade, that is export and import between all African economies, and the US is less than 50 billion US dollars. That is not great. South Korea alone is doing more than 150 billion US dollars to the US. So, I mean, trade between the US and South Korea. So the continent of Africa, our size of trade also reflects, okay, I don't want to jump, don't let me jump. Let me continue to break it down. So in terms of aid, there's the economy and of course there's military aid. So the US, being the richest country in the world, they give aid to Africa, of course, not even only Africa, but in Africa they give aid. So a key part of this is so they give aid, and those aid are usually in two forms. Of course, there is the economic aid and there is the military aid. So most African economies actually do receive economic aid. So let me give some examples that we have here. We have Ethiopia, 2.2 billion, around 2.2 billion, Egypt, 1.3 billion. But for Egypt, most of it is military aid. Nigeria is about 1.1 billion. And so in total, US provides a combined estimated aid of about 20 billion to African economies. So that is also not great. It's not massive. So when we talk about direct impact of the US and what is going on today, you will notice that Africa is not quite in the conversation. The reason why Africa is not in that conversation is because our direct relationship with the US is very, very small. Our indirect impact, though, can be very, very huge. So we should note that. So while trade with Africa is small, it is nonetheless significant for the continent. Why? And I will explain why. In Nigeria, let me use Nigeria as an example. In Nigeria, we have just removed fuel subsidy. When I mean just remove, I'm talking in the last 20 months, the government has removed fuel subsidy, right? The rich, they spend more on fuel, right? But by removing the fuel subsidy, the poor suffered more. So because the rich spend a smaller proportion of their income on fuel, but the poor, they spend a huge proportion of their income on fuel-related prices, such as transport, such as food, such as, so it's the same thing in the global economy. Even though the China, the Europeans, and the Asian tigers, they have, bigger relationship with the US. When it actually comes to impact, it is economies like Africa, economies like the ones in Africa that actually suffer the most. So let me just quickly draw your attention to the indirect way, because that's also one thing that you have to note. When you're looking at trade, don't just focus on import and export. Look at the broader economic relations, and then you'll begin to understand the complexities and how policies in different economies or in different areas of the global economy is affecting Africa either positively or negatively. So Africa's trade is conducted in the US dollars. I'm sure we know that there are plans to change that, but that is not going to happen soon. It's not going to happen in this decade. And I'll be very, very surprised even if it happens in the next decade. So perhaps another, even the Chinese and of course the Europeans and the others have been trying to change the currency in which they trade. And given even their size and their influence, they still find it very, very difficult. So just imagine the small pride that Africa is in making such effort. So a critical part of that economic relations, and I think this is one thing that I think is important to mention, is changing financial conditions for Africa. So interest rate decisions in the US are made for US domestic economy. So what I mean by that is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank in the US does not make interest rate changes on the basis of economic conditions in Nigeria. It does not make interest rate changes on the basis of economic conditions in Europe. However, when it does make those changes, they have implications for everyone else. Why? Because the reference point for our borrowing is the US interest rate. So if you notice, since 2022, the cost of borrowing in the international market has been going up for everyone, including, especially for African economies. Just yesterday or 2 days ago, I was looking at the yield for African Euro debts, and it's now about 10-11%. That is huge for a country like Nigeria, and it's the same for many other African countries. So it raises the cost of borrowing, it tightens our financial conditions, and of course, it makes us very, very vulnerable to defaulting on those debts. So I've kind of set what I call a summary of what is like the US and Africa economic relations. I've tried to leave the Chinese and the Europeans out of it and just set the basic summary for Africa. So the second question now, what is happening to after? My expectation is that I will take this brief presentation, then we can take questions, specific questions. So what is happening to AFTA? First, we all know the background, the AFTA. The background, the AFTA, in case we are not aware of it, was actually the big work was done in 2012. Let me put it that way. The big work was done in 2012. In 2012, that was when all the countries signed what we now call the 2063 agenda. That's the big agenda for Africa. That's in 2012. So there were many signatories in the 2012. Then the process for AFTA actually started. But in terms of AFTA itself, it was concluded in 2019, just before COVID. So that is when we now have AFTA. So we have about 54 to 56 countries that have signed the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And if you're looking for a single purpose of AFTA, it will be to boost intra-Africa trade. Because if you remove loads of restrictions within trade between African economies, the expectation is that the percentage of trade between these economies will go up. So if Nigeria is doing maybe 2% with South Africa, 0.5% with Egypt, the expectation is over time. The trade between all these countries, Kenya, Uganda, I think the East Africans are actually doing better than the other regions. And the Southern African too is not doing too badly. And of course, the West Africa corridor too is not bad. But anyway, the expectation is that the 16% intra-Africa trade at the moment is not good enough. We need to do better. So that is the purpose. But underlining that purpose is also the notion that trade is good for Africa. Trade is good for Africa. So if it's good for Africa, so let's boost that trade. Let's boost that trade. So as I said before, the project was started as Agenda 2063, is the Africa's Development Framework, and it was approved at the 18th Ordinary Session of Assembly in Addis Ababa in January 2012. Then they started the process of AFTA. So where are we on AFTA? The simple answer is that AFTA has not commenced. That's the simple answer. So what I mean by it has not commenced is why you have the agreement, but there has not been trade under that agreement, because there are still things that needs to be worked out, before it can come into force. So you have to negotiate, you have to negotiate tariff concessions, you have to negotiate rules of origin, you have to negotiate other issues. Trade is very, very complex, and trade agreements are very, very, very complex. So it's good to get young people involved these days so that you can grow in all these issues. So preferential trade, because, let me just say it. Whenever we talk about great trade agreements, what it means is that you want to be trading with a group of people on a preferential basis. So it means a group of people have come together and say, oh, as a group, this group, as a group, we want to trade on a preferential basis. It means that, let's say, for instance, our tariff levels cannot go beyond 2% because we want to boost trade. So it does mean that the competition between the economies is not going to be on the basis of tariffs. The competition is going to be on the basis of innovation. It's going to be on the basis of other things, but not on tariff. So that is why you have trade agreement. But as I said, the simple answer to what is happening to after now is there is no trade at the moment. There has not been any trade on that agreement. So the third aspect want to just touch on before I take questions that you may have is trade important for growth in Africa? Is trade important for growth? Most African economies now have been economic growth of less than 5%. Nigeria is doing about 3%. Some are doing 4%, but everybody is on what I call a slow growth trajectory at the moment. So growth is growth is slow. But there was a time, and I don't know whether most of you remember this, especially from 2000 to about 2015, 2016, most African economies actually grew on average of 5% and above. So that was on the back of what? That was on the back of strong commodity prices. So trade can be good for Africa. So, but let me even start by saying this. The foundation, and I want to broaden this argument just so that you know that the area that you're working on is a very, very good area. The foundation of all economic progress in life since Adam and Eve, the foundation of all the economic progress we have seen, my great-grandfather, your own great-grandfather, even before then, is exchange, is trade. The reason we are seeing progress is because there is trade. If there's no trade, there wouldn't have been progress. So if not for exchange, all of us would have to produce the food we eat, we have to produce the clothes we wear, we have to produce the houses we live, and the cars we drive. So if I am not trading, it means that the food I had this morning, I would have probably gone to the farm like 4 a.m. to go and get it. And the shirt I'm wearing, I don't even have an idea where it was made. So, but I would have had to sew something to wear before I go to then actually also build my own house. So, of course, none of us do that. None of us do all these three things. You may be doing some, which is maybe your business, but none of us do that. Why? Because they started trading long time ago. So with trading comes specialization. That's the first thing that trading does. With trading comes specialization. With specializations, it comes development in skills, innovation, and knowledge. So first, you have specialization. So I decide to specialize in this area. This is the area I want to be relevant in the economy. And of course, the second one is that because you specialize, you begin to do something repeatedly, you improve the ways you do things. So skills, innovations, and that is why I said trade is responsible for all the progress we have made. So, however, with trade, because of its complexities, also comes risk, different economic dimensions, complexities, changing economic conditions, complex international trade that sums up the global economy. Yes, with something that is good, also comes things that are complex. So that's just the nature of life. If you live a simple life and you don't want trouble in your life, you just want to be simple, you just want to wake up and sleep. No complexity. It also means that you will not be rich, you will not be relevant, and nobody will care about you. You will just remain where you are. If it's that simple life. But if you want to rise to the top, if you want to do other things, any good thing, then it has to be complex. So, excuse me. So, with those complexities, and let me give some summary of, I'll stop in the next 5 minutes. So let's look at the last 5 years, for instance. In the last 5 years, there's been COVID-19, that was in 2020. The war in Ukraine, that was 2022. Then tightening financial markets, also from 2022, 23, 24. You see have some elements of that today. You have volatile commodity exports also in the last 5 years. So all these complexities, they came with their shocks. All these shocks came with problems for African economies. Nonetheless, we cannot say trade is not good. Trade is good. The question we must then ask ourselves, and I will come to that, the 3 or 4 questions we must ask ourselves if we are going to improve the economic conditions of African economies. So after calls for stronger intra-Africa trade, I think I shared that before, strategic investments in transport and technology infrastructure, bolder economic reforms, and better use of innovative financial tools. So that is what it does. So I have set, the summary, and of course, mentioned some issues around why we have the complexities, the shocks, and of course that we have. However, if we are going to think about trade and growth in Africa, especially in relation to Africa's prosperity, I think we Africans need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions, which I started with and I'm concluding with now. We must ask ourselves, why do people trade? So if I am going to lead the trade effort for Nigeria, for instance, I have to ask myself, the people, the countries that have done well from trade, why did they trade? How did they trade? What did they trade? So because if you haven't answered those questions and really discussing them in details, you may not be able to come up with your own country's strategy to benefit from the global economic trade system. Let me go back to the US as an example. The US is the largest economy in the world. But since the year 2000, the ratio of manufacturing jobs in the economy have continued to decline, and it's now currently less than 8%. And the current president thinks that is not sustainable. Now he wants to change the system. He wants to change the way the US trade with the world. He can do that because he is the president of the largest economy. But in economics, there's something we call price taker and price giver. So the US in the international trade system is like a price giver. It's not a taker. But African economies, we are price takers. So if we have price takers in economies, so we have to think differently. We cannot say, oh, this is our rule, you have to follow it, because we don't have the power, we don't have the influence, we don't have the wealth to do that. So we should ask ourselves, why do people trade? What do they trade? How can we make trade better? If we don't ask ourselves these very, very important questions, they are not questions you answer here on 1 hour conversation. It's not even a 3-day work. It's serious political, economic, and social questions we need to ask ourselves. So as young people focused on trade in Africa, please ask why. Continue to ask why. Hopefully, in the coming generation, we will have a situation in which trade is beneficial to Africa. Trade is improving Africa growth. Trade is making Africa prosper. On that note, I thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Doctor. Please, let's all give a round of applause to him. We can, give the reactions there. Whilst we are doing that, I'll just read out a few comments, suggestions, and questions. So I think the first is from Wabisa. I think she's from Kenya. She says, this is a suggestion. She says the US is a developed state, entailing that if we trade with it as African countries, that means already we are existing on an imbalanced scale of trading. The US market is stronger than African countries. For an example, for $1 is around or close to 20 rands, if I'm correct. Yeah, I want to follow up with a question. So, Doc, you spoke about doing business with the US and then the European countries, which is costly. I just want to know, let's just say Africans come together. I don't know how they'll do that agreement, but then they come together to agree that they are going to trade within themselves, and then they wouldn't involve maybe European countries or the US. What do you think the financial implications would be? And also, what would be the challenges that we'll face? Yeah, so that's my question.
If I understand you very well,
Yeah,
they're suggesting that Africa trades only with itself. Is that correct?
yes.
But why would we want to trade only with ourselves?
Doing business with them is expensive. Like how Mwabisa is saying, that it's not balanced. So once we are trading amongst ourselves, our currency can, sustain us instead of doing business with them.
No. Okay, so let's look at it this way.
Okay.
I said that we must ask ourselves, how do we improve the conditions or our home benefits from trade, right? But it does not mean that we don't have benefit from trade, even as we speak. For instance, the fact that we are able to hold this meeting is because of trade. Except you are telling me that the iPad I'm using, that Kenya makes it, or Lesotho makes it, but I'm not aware of that. So the point is not to shut your door. No, they don't even go back there, because we are going back more than 150 or 200 years. It won't work. So the question is, how do we improve how we trade? That should be our focus. Trade, currency, I don't want to be going into currency issues, because currency is just a means of exchange. So there are many dimensions of why. So for instance, we sell mostly raw commodities.
Yeah.
We sell mostly raw commodities. So what that means is that because you sell raw commodities, and because you are not very rich, it means that, so we cannot say that, oh, we are not trading with the US, we are not trading with Europe, we are not trading with Asia. No, we must trade. We trade. Every day is about trade. We trade, we exchange. And if we don't trade, we don't exchange, we can't make progress. So it's not about one extreme to the other. It's about how do we improve our trade relations. Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Doc. Okay, we have a question from Marion. She says, how does specialization based on comparative advantage lead to increased global output and efficiency?
I love this question. This is a very good question, because most people, they get this wrong about trade. So it's like let me just answer it the way I think people will understand. So what is Africa's comparative advantage? Who defines what is a comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is the lie of the economist. It's a lie of the economist. Let me tell you what I mean by that. So, what is US comparative advantage? You say, oh, it's not manufacturing, it's financial services, right? It is financial services because they created the conditions for them to do so well in financial services. They created conditions for them to do so well in tech. They created conditions for them to do so well in software development. They created conditions for them to do so well in logistics. So the point I'm trying to make is there is nobody in this world that was born with any comparative advantage. The only thing that you can call a comparative advantage is the things that God deposited in your own area of the world. Everything else, everyone else has learned it. So if you can learn it better, it can also become your comparative advantage. So they will tell you in Africa that your comparative advantage is to grow cocoa and sell cocoa. Okay, but what if cocoa is not delivering the prosperity that we want in Africa? Are we going to keep selling cocoa? Or we are going to keep selling cocoa as it is? No. So what people call comparative advantage is what was developed over time. So in Africa, we also have to develop our own comparative advantage, except we want to remain poor. So if you don't want to remain poor, let me give you an example. So let's say in school, I believe most of us went to school. So, in fact, I'm going to use myself as an example. If you ask me what I used to love so much, and I'm talking 10, 15 years ago, it will shock you. Do you know what it was? Driving. I don't like driving anymore, but I used to love driving. In fact, there was a time, if I have a driver, my driver will sit down by my side and I'll be driving. So why am I not a driver? Because driving will not pay my obligations. So it is very, very important that we don't box ourselves into this notion of comparative advantage is not static. That is the point I'm trying to make. It is developed over time. It can be developed. And of course, it depends on how you want to relate. That's why I said you should ask that question. How do you want to relate with the world? And don't just box yourself in. Trade is not static. Comparative advantage is not static. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc. I hope my question is answered. We have another question from Ivan. How do we promote inter-free border trade in Africa?
Simple. Remove all the restrictions. There's no other way now. Remove all the restrictions and let people compete on other bases, not compete on base of tariffs. Remove all the restrictions and let people compete. Yes, that's the best way. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Doc. Firewini, I hope I had your name right. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Doctor, for sharing your wonderful insight with us. How do African countries improve import-export trade imbalances?
Sorry, come again.
Yeah, so how do African countries improve import and export trade imbalances?
By improving the things that we trade with. By improving that. So those are the questions I'm talking about. So each country we have to say, it's not a 1-week job, obviously. It's not a 2-year job. It's to say, look, in the last 60 years, this is the way we have been trading. But we remain poor, or we are not doing so well. So you can then imagine the future. What is going to happen in the global economy in the next 20 to 30 years? And you position yourself. So how do you position yourself? You start to invest in areas that you think the world will need in 15, 20 years' time. You start to invest in that area. You start to make innovations. You start to come up with IP, intellectual property. You start to do things new way. If you are into agriculture, for instance, it is no longer sufficient for you to be doing the kind of yield that you were doing 20, 40 years ago. One, population is growing. Two, the number of people in agriculture, they are reducing every day. So it means that the yield has to go up. So the way to improve our trade imbalances is also to produce things of value to the global economy. So we cannot continue to produce only the cocoa, the cassava, the whatever. We need to invest in areas where over time, we too can start to improve on the commodities, on the goods, on the items that we sell to the world. Let me try and put it this way. The way individuals prosper in life is the way companies prosper in life. It's the same way that nations prosper. It's about investing in areas of great value for the future. So, but it's not as easy as I've just said it. You need to sit down understand your strength, understand your weaknesses, understand your location, understand what is happening in the global economy today, understand what may happen in 5, 10, 15, 20, 40 years, and position yourself, and then take it from there.
All right, thank you very much, Doc. Tenel says a lot of African countries still have trade rules that don't match up with different trade zones, taxes, and currencies, which makes it hard for businesses, especially small ones, to trade across borders. What can be done to make things easier for MSMEs, and how can the African Free Continental Trade Area actually help small businesses benefit from trade across the continent? So that's from Tenel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya, for that question. That's a very, very good question. We are saying the same thing. So the HAFTA, since 2019, no trade. Why? Because they are trying to work around the restriction. But if you ask me, I will tell you, the restrictions that they are working around on is really about what the conditions are at the moment. I don't think we tend to focus so much on the cost of trade, because trade actually do have cost. What I mean cost, meaning there are negative side of trade, right? Some people will lose out in trade. So, but as nations, we tend to focus on the negatives. We don't tend to focus on the potential positives. And the reason is simple. For the cost and for the negatives, it's usually very obvious. But the opportunities are usually not that obvious. So, for instance, I run a business in Nigeria. The truth is, I don't know the opportunities that will be open to me if they remove all the restrictions in after. Oh, I don't know yet. But there may be. But the ones that are already doing business today in Africa, they already know that if they do this will what will happen to their business. So I think that is the dilemma. That is why nations work so much on continued restrictions rather than looking for new opportunities. But if we are going to do this, we just have to try. We have to try and bite the bullet, remove as much restrictions as possible, and let's make progress on the continent.
Okay. Alina from Zambia, she says, how can trade diversify African economics away from raw material dependency?
Investment. If you want to develop new things, you invest in that area. If you want to develop new things, you invest in that area. So, we were all born, right? In some years, some of us many, many years ago, some of you maybe 20, 30 years ago, right? What did your parents do? The first thing your parents do is, okay, look, ensure that you go to school. Why? They're making an investment in your future. With your education, they know that they're building a foundation for you to be able to leverage the opportunities that will be available in the future. Now, think about it. Think about somebody that is 30 or 25 years old and did not have any education. Then imagine what kind of opportunities are available to that person. Why? You see the stark difference. Why? One investment was made. Second, the other one investment was not made. So it's about investment. If you want to grow in new areas, you invest in that area. But our governments are not investing in new areas. They continue to invest in the old areas. They continue to extract from the old areas. If you don't invest in new areas, don't be surprised that you're not going to benefit from that area. Simple.
Okay, thank you. Sling Graphics, I don't know who that is. Thank you very much for sharing with this important information. Okay, let me move on to Marion. Marion says, one thing you said about not imposing tariffs, would it be a disadvantage for domestic trade, or what would be the implications on domestic trade?
I don't understand what you mean by domestic trade. So what domestic trade? Because domestic trade has a location. So it depends. It depends on what we are saying. I did not say don't impose tariffs. I'm saying that as Africans, we must work to remove as much restriction as possible. Because the restrictions at the moment are just too many of them. We need to remove restrictions as much as possible, including visa restrictions. There are so many restrictions when it comes to Africa. So we need to remove as many as possible. I need to understand this question very well. I don't understand. It's not very clear. Disadvantage of domestic trade. What is domestic trade? I mean, is it Nigeria, is it Kenya, or is it Africa? Compared to which one? So I need to understand it. Yes.
Yeah,
If the person write another question, we can move on from that.
Okay, hopefully she get back to us. I'm moving on to Alina. Alina says, how can increase intra-African trade contribute to Africa's long-term economic prosperity?
Simple. Because at the start of my presentation, I said, what does trade allow you to do? Trade allows you to specialize. And when you specialize, it allows you to what? To carry out innovations, skills. So you begin to improve in one area. So let's look at it, for instance. Let's say because of intra-Africa trade, specialization, I didn't mention the second as a scale. So let's say somebody was producing 2 million bottles of water, right? At the moment, somebody is producing 2 million bottles of water. With greater level of specialization and scale, the person may be able to produce 5 million bottles of water because there's now a bigger market to serve. And that means that the person is able to sell his bottle of water cheaper than anyone else. So what that does is that allows some other people to be able to do some other things with also bigger markets. Instead of serving the small markets in their domestic economies, they're able to serve larger numbers of people. And with that, you have scale. With that, you have improved profit. With that, you have more room for investment. With more investment, you have savings. With savings, you have reduction in interest rates. So there are so many multiple benefits of us being able to do things on a massive scale, and of course, with little restrictions to trade as much as possible on the continent. Yes.
Okay, so Victor says, thank you for your time, sir. My understanding of trade is that it is also includes sharing intellectual knowledge, which I believe is key for Africa, given our abundance of talent. However, reports indicate that travel between African countries is more expensive and visa processes are more restrictive for Africans than for foreigners accessing our own continent. I reckon, again, with what you said on visa restrictions. So my question is, what policies would you suggest after implement to address these barriers? And how can young professionals position themselves to advocate or champion such initiatives?
Yeah, thank you.
Please let me add to that. This is Chine Owanaka. I'm the convener, co-founder of Africa Policy Conversations. Thank you so much for the amazing session. Just to add to that last question, as Africa Policy Conversations, we are championing this hashtag trade, not aid, meaning that we believe that, the growth of the continent, wealth creation, revolves around diversifying our economies, trading amongst ourselves and with the rest of the world. And with this whole situation happening with the US and all the tariff wars, we see it as an opportunity for Africa to really rethink its strategy around trade and also have a rethink about some of its policies and just capitalize on the opportunity. So my question would just be just in line with what the other person just asked, what are the low-hanging fruits? What can we do as individuals and also as an organization? What are the focus areas? What should we focus on in terms of the advocacy and the sensitization that needs to happen with our young people, with our policymakers? And finally, we'll also need to call on you again because we're hoping to have this as a report because we want to be able to gather data on this subject. We want to be able to do a report. And we're having a conference on Africa Day. Africa Day is on Sunday, so we're having it the next day after Africa Day. And really, the core topic is on trade. So we would definitely want to invite you to be part of that very important conversation. And, after all our findings from now till then, we want to be able to publish the things that we've learned, the things that we found, and be able to make recommendations to our policymakers. So I guess that's a question and also a request as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So How should young people get involved at this stage? First, I would say try and understand why Africa is struggling to start after. I think that's very, very important. Because I don't even know the details, but our government will know the details. So why has trade not commenced under after? That's number one. Number two, looking at, there are so many barriers here. All those barriers will not be removed on day one. They will not be removed on day one because otherwise we'll have those trade now. So you can focus on some elements of those restrictions. So you can take the low hanging fruit, for instance, visa restrictions. Why there may be visa restrictions, no problem. But can we reduce, let's say, the cost of the visa, for instance? That may be something that you may want to champion. Can we try and promote and call for the availability of flights, increased level of flight between Africa? I know it's growing, but it's not growing as much as we like. So we have, of course, you have to South Africa, you have Nigeria to Ghana, you have Nigeria to Kenya, you have Nigeria to, I think there's Nigeria to Uganda. Okay, but can we have more? Can we have more? I'm not talking of only Nigeria alone, so can we have more? And can we try and work on reducing the cost between all these African economies? So that's number two. Then number three, I think, let me just say it this way. Most of the things that we do in Africa, sometimes, I think we want to do too many things at the same time. If I were in government, the first thing I'll probably try and do regarding after is, can we do the minimum? So for instance, let's say we have 100 things to do. So that we have at least the first trade under after. Can we just even do 1%? Say, okay, we have started, we remove 1% of whatever it is. Let's start. And let's see what that is look like in 6 months' time or in 1 year time, then we can come back. But I think because we can't predict the future, we cannot predict the future. We can only work towards the future that we want. So if we want to remove intra-African trade, let's start by just, removing something, maybe something that is inconsequential, and let's make progress from that. So for me, those are the things that I think we can do. In terms of your request, reach out to me the way you reach out to me this time, and I will see whether it's something that I can work on. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Doc. Thank you for the presentation. It was insightful, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us. We hope to hear again.